All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ben Brooks. I'm the founder and CEO of Pilot. I'm based here in New York City, and this is the panel at the StartOut Equity Summit called Making Equity a Culture Essential. I've got some fantastic and very talented, passionate, experienced panelists to work with today and to share and learn with. I was a part of the StartOut Strategic Growth Lab. It's a 6-month program for LGBT founders of different organizations. So I've benefited from this organization, given money, gotten mentorship from the organization, and really am thrilled and honored to help facilitate this panel. So we've got the chat open today. So if you are not used to coming to a lot of these virtual events, drop in the chat any conversation you'd like to have. We'd love to know where you're joining from. If you've got questions, we're going to be looking. I see Christus from Colorado. We got Corey Ann from Dallas and others. So please drop questions, thoughts, ideas in the chat, because we'd like, in the spirit of inclusivity, to create your thoughts and contributions to this. So I'm going to first start with Brittany Hale, she, her, hers pronouns. She's the interim CEO and COO of Digital Undivided, and the organization helps catalyze economic growth through research, programming, and advocacy for Latina and Black women founders. We asked Brittany what would be a sentence the audience would want to know about her background with DEI, and I have an award-winning consultancy that advances and manages a portfolio of impact engagements and can demonstrate what equitable environments look like, from government to enterprise to nonprofit sectors. And if you're connecting on chat or on LinkedIn afterwards, I always like to add a human interest to things. And Brittany shares that she's committed to merging fun, service, and advocacy. She's developed a mock trial program as the first Black woman president of her city's Board of Education, using fairy tales for 4th to 6th grade children. Very groovy. So Brittany, I'd love to know from you, what do you think is a major challenge that organizations and workplaces are facing as they strive to make them more equitable?
So thank you so much, Ben, for that introduction. And hi, Corey. Hi, Paolo. So when we think about ways to make organizations more equitable in 2023, it'd be remiss if we did not mention the fact that we're dealing with most organizations are at least hybrid, and some, like Digital Undivided, are completely virtual. And in that space, when you're dealing with people of different backgrounds who live in different areas, who have different accesses to resources, how do you create a virtual environment where everyone can succeed and everyone truly knows that the organization and the leaders within the organization are investing in them? So I'll start there.
Great. And we think a lot about that. Pilot is remote first as well. And there's a lot of upside to that, but there's also things we have to be really thoughtful, because sometimes what we can't see, we don't know we need to manage or be thoughtful about. So
exactly.
Great. So Dominique, I'll go to you next. Dominique Reese, pronouns are she, her, hers. Dominique is the head of DEI at Plug and Play Tech Center. Plug and Play Tech Center is an innovation platform that connects startups with corporations and investors to foster collaboration and accelerate technological advancements worldwide. When I asked Dominique about her background with DEI, she said, I'm someone that leads more with action and implementation versus words. Action is what creates change, and why I started Plug and Play's diversity arm, Drive. And again, on the personal side for Dominique, she is a lover of animals and nature overall, and it's her dream to go to Thailand and ride an elephant one day, which, Dominique, I encourage you to do. So, Dominique, I'd love to know from you the same question I asked Brittany around what's a major challenge that workplaces are facing relative to making their organizations more equitable in 2023, or organizations at large?
Yeah, good to be here, and thanks for the intro. I would say, especially with everything that's going on in the economy, transparency is definitely key, if not outwardly facing for the organization, but at least internally for employees, being as transparent with them as possible. So at least they know how to steer conversations and what personally their journey looks like internally moving forward is something that's definitely key.
So we got the remote context to figure out. We've got transparency. And my next amazing panelist is Candice Morgan. Pronouns are she, her, hers. She's a partner and the head of equity, diversity, and inclusion at GV, formerly known as Google Ventures. GV exists to catalyze innovation for enduring impact with extraordinary returns. We find and accelerate founders that we believe in, that will have a positive impact and lasting impact on the world that yields incredible financial returns. In terms of her DEI background, she spent nearly 20 years in the DEI space, including the heads at roles of Pinterest and Google Ventures, and advised companies from founding level to global Fortune 500s in implementing lasting strategies for equity at work. And in terms of a fun fact and a personal side beyond just the work, she's lived in Switzerland and can instantly recognize Swiss German. So Dominique, or sorry, Candice, great to have you here. And would love to know from you, Candice, when you think about challenges that organizations and workplaces are facing related to being more equitable in 2023, how do you see the landscape?
Well, I think one thing, well, first of all, thanks for bearing with me as I figured out how to get my camera set up. So
you're just on time. It was just perfect. It was just, you're right there. Yeah.
The elephant in the room. And hi, Dominique. Hi, Brittany. I think there are many challenges, but one of them is certainly the fact that the DEI movement and the EI, however they're being conflated, has become very wrapped up in political campaigns. And I think it has fostered even greater misunderstanding of what this work really is. Already there was a huge perception problem where DEI was generally pigeonholed into hiring, particularly hiring people of color and women. And that was pretty much the entirety of what people associated the field with. Therefore, companies were kind of off the hook or thinking about their products or their services, their customers, and that sort of thing. And I think that's going to continue, that misunderstanding, over the next election cycle, if I'm honest.
And I feel like campaign slogans are usually not meant to educate, right? So I think that's a great point. So in addition to the remote part of the transparency, there's also kind of the culture wars and political slogans and reductivism online, et cetera. So, let's start, we're talking equity, but there's another E word, equality. And so a lot of times we talk about equality in DEI, but then there's this equity term. How are those different or how are those similar? Who would like to start on that one?
I'll just pop in. This is something that our team at Digital Undivided, again, we are looking to create a space where Latina and Black women founders can catalyze their worth in their work and create an equitable entrepreneurial ecosystem. Equality is when you're treating everyone the same, right? For our purposes, all entrepreneurs would receive the same level of funding. Equity is when you're providing people with the resources that they need. And so we always want to remember that that playing field is not the same. At Digital Undivided, we have in-house research. We study Latina and Black women over years to chronicle the ways in which they are not providing equal access and equitable resources. And so as we, I'm happy to see my panelists to share what the difference is, but that's how we characterize it at Digital Undivided. And that's the challenge that we have within our space.
Yeah. Oh, do you want to? Okay, I'll go. I totally agree, Brittany. I think just with what you said, I think that if you look at the history of workplaces and how also how DEI has evolved in workplaces, even the HR function, if we go back even further, was originally instituted around certain compliance-related things and regulations and consistency and so forth. And so the going kind of understanding of how to do things well was to do things the same. And so, over time, all of those functions evolved, and we learned that people need different things to be successful in an organization. Same thing about having access to an organization or having, to Brittany's point, access to capital. And so we've evolved the thinking to go from treat everyone exactly the same to treat people with the things that they need specifically as themselves to be as successful as possible. And that's how we think about, that's how I think about equity.
Yeah. And I mean, every time I hear those two words, the picture always comes into my mind of the fence and the boxes. And I think it's interesting that now there's like a third image that's come over time of like liberation or justice, and the fence is taken down. But I'd say like overall, at least for us here as well, when we talk about investment, when we pass on an investment, what is the reason and what help can we provide to get them to the investment stage later on? And I think that's something interesting that organizations are doing now, of providing startups with grants or non-dilutive grants, that they're not taking any equity, but making sure that they get them to the stage that they are supposed to be at, in terms of being investable in. So, I mean, my main thought when coming to this, words is always that box image.
And Candice just dropped it in the chat. Candice attempted to do that while talking and looking at notes. So you don't worry about the camera. You're on the chat. We had a team here. So, and I think there's also a Shel Silverstein one from like the tree and apples dropping.
Yes.
There's justice at the bottom of that one as well, which I think is also a very beautiful depiction. And I sometimes think about this too. You know, you think about even physical abilities or people that have disabilities, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and you think about, you know, an accommodation, right? Someone might need adaptive technology. We have a U.S. senator, right, who uses different adaptive technology. He doesn't have different, you know, responsibilities or powers, but like how he's going to communicate, right, might need some support to do that, right? And so I think that this is, you know, a mindset. And I like, Candice, that you're bringing up this idea that the same, right? And I think HR in particular has a drive to kind of, you know, create that equality from sameness. Employee experience is often in like this idea of consistency, but it can be at the expense of equity. And when organizations think about, you know, and I think this is a little like, you know, equity and equality tie a little bit similar to like racism, where everyone's like, we're not racist. Like, there's nothing here. You know, of course we're for equity, or of course we're for equality. And it's hard to admit that there might be an unlevel playing field, right? Even if it's obvious from like data and, you know, structural and, you know, socioeconomic and societal sort of data. How do organizations assess and get sort of a fact-based or data-driven understanding of if they're equitable or not? Because I bet that there's an incentive for executives to want to think that their organizations are equitable, and for boards of directors and for investors. But how do we get people into a bit of a reality in that regard? I'm going to do opposite, maybe Dominic, and then we'll do Candice, then Brittany. How's that?
Perfect.
Great.
I would say it's always employees first. What are you hearing from your employees, and creating that environment for them to, one, want to be open with you, and two, when they are open, how are you applying what they're saying and actually creating change to get to the place that you need to be. So no one better than your own employees that are at your organization to help you move that along.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's often this tension between, you know, what employees need and are seeking, and then leadership. There tends to be this like gap where sometimes leadership has important context on certain decisions and why they're made, but aren't very transparent about that, or aren't very transparent that a decision has even been made on certain things. And employees are left wondering, hey, what happened, right? And I think we're seeing this right now with the work from home, hybrid, in office kind of tug of war a little bit conversations. And it's really important, to Dominique's point, to listen to employees and understand why, because we tend to see that certain people were able to facilitate other parts of their lives and even work better when they were working from home, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe for other employees, that wasn't the case. So, you know, going back to the equity piece, in terms of data, throughout my career, I've been focused on people analytics to understand some of the differences in the way people move through organizations. And I would say some of the most, you know, telling data has been one around attrition rates, both voluntary and involuntary. Like, you know, I work in venture capital. Senior women tend to leave at higher rates than men, and senior women are less represented or promoted into senior GP roles compared to men, right? And so those metrics tell you something over time, even if you have a story for each individual. When you start to see a pattern, you have to really pay attention. I think the other thing is, you know, all companies run employee surveys generally, and often that data is not cut very well to understand some of the differences that people are experiencing in terms of belonging or thriving or access to information about how to advance in their roles. And I think that's really important. Then once you have that type of data, usually the numbers are smaller for some of these communities. So the data might not tell you as obvious a story, and you have to go follow that up with like actually talking to people or getting a third party to do so if people aren't as comfortable, if they need to keep it anonymous, which is usually the case. So all of those data points can help you uncover inequities.
So Ben, you brought up an interesting point where people, we talk about the automatic reaction, right? Which is based in our ego. We don't want to believe we're a bad person. I'm not racist. I'm not biased. We believe we have more control over who we are and how we behave than we actually do. And so at Digital Undivided, we address that a few different ways. For our internal teams, we do have, to Candice's point, we have monthly well-being surveys where we check in with people, but we're also seeking to operationalize some of our values, one of which is cultural competency and curiosity. We task ourselves with having the courage enough to be curious about what we believe to be true and how we know that is, right? How is that showing up and how can we prove it? And that, again, ultimately is seeking to impact the founders, most of whom have been chronically under-resourced by VC, because who we believe is capable of success as a leader, especially leader of a startup, typically doesn't look like a lot of the Latina and Black women that we're serving. So we're having that courage to support them, but also to support our employees, to listen to the harsh feedback, to listen to the less than savory feedback, question, well, is it true? And if so, how can we move together? How can we ideate together and strategize to create a more equitable system where everyone really can grow?
Yeah, I think there's, I hear, there's a quantitative part, there's the qualitative, right? And the human factors and the environmental conditions beyond the office and people's origin that can affect a lot of those things. And Candice, with Pilot, we were focused on employee development and self-advocacy. And many employees, depending on the family they grew up in, the background they come from, don't know that they need to advocate for themselves, that they need to ask, to express their interest, to solicit feedback, to set boundaries, to clarify expectations, to express desires around comp, all of that. And if they think you just kind of put your head down and you'll be rewarded, but if other people can go golfing with their dad and say, hey, you should talk to your boss and take him out for beers and do this thing, and they learn this sort of secret code to get ahead, right? That's sort of an example. And I think that the personal stories all three of you talked about, I have a dear friend of mine who, went to college for a semester and dropped out, and it was from a background and family where it was difficult to do that. And he got into construction. He's now a wildly successful executive, right? But I know from his lived experience, every time he changes jobs and he sees college degree, even preferred, not required, even as preferred, he's like, they're not going to look at me. And this is a person who's like making a multiple six-figure income, very successful SVP level person. There's 25 years into their career. So at Pilot, we decided, we had thought about it. We're like, do we really require a college degree? And do we really prefer it? And we decided no. And so all of our job postings, we eliminated that from the posting as a signal, right, at the very beginning, that we're open to people from potentially a different profile or background. But literally a bullet point in a job description can create an off-ramp for all sorts of people from different backgrounds, right? So some of these things are really nuanced, sort of in my experience. And I guess that brings back to our next question is, equity, who owns it inside the organization? Is this HR's job? Is this someone else's job? Dominique, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think just around the world, everyone assumes that it's under HR or it should be under HR. I don't know how many messages I get on LinkedIn saying, oh, I know we're in the similar space and you work in recruitment. And I'm like, actually, I don't. And when I stepped into this role, I strategically asked to not be under HR. Because from my experience, I know these type of not that what HR does not talk about is, or what HR talks about is not important, but I think these type of conversations should sit just within coming from C-suite and have its own kind of siloed part within the organization outside of HR, because there's a lot more things that fall under the topic of DE&I that sometimes it's not HR related. And I think it goes broader than the organization, which I think we'll talk about a little later. But I think it should not fall under HR, but that's my personal opinion.
Brittany, how do you feel about that?
Dominic, I agree with you. And what I typically say is, if doing what was federally and state compliant was enough, we would not be in the space that we're in, right? This is not solely about HR. It's truly about, from our perspective, really operationalizing those values and living them day to day. I do agree it starts in the C-suite, but it is a challenge and a task for everyone. So again, we're 100% remote. We have team members in other countries. And so I am a native English speaker. I learned Spanish in college. I am now learning Portuguese, and obrigada to my Brazilian team because it's an opportunity to connect more deeply, right, to your team members. And it is, again, continually being curious. And we all know that there are opportunities for us to do that. So to Dominic's point, definitely starts at the C-suite, flows all the way through. You know, trickle down economics may not work in practice, but trickle down equity may work in organizations.
Yeah, it's very common for organizations to set up, for example, let's just take the thing that diversity is usually pigeonholed in, which is like, again, recruiting women and people of color. Even in that case, the responsibility of building a diverse pipeline in recruiting is often put on recruiters, who are then judged and their performance evaluations influenced by the hiring managers. So the hiring managers don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. Then the recruiter is nervous to try to push that, right? It's a really backwards model of accountability. The accountability has to come from the C-suite and ultimately the CEO and the leadership team for equity, right? Honestly, for a lot of the equity initiatives. I've had folks who were allies saying, oh, well, there was a manager, for example, who at an organization I'd worked at, who said, hey, I do notice that, with my, the Black woman on my team tends to get more questions, like more scrutiny about certain things. And, I've kind of noticed like the feedback, like that other people wouldn't get, and she tends to get. And I was like, you should make sure she sees you and she knows that this is a phenomenon that happens. And he's like, oh, should I say anything? I'm like, absolutely, you should say something. And you should say something to the people that are giving you that feedback, because you have a really important role in letting them know and using your voice on this that can really have ripple effects for like the norms of this type of back channel, right? So yeah, I think equity, the onus on equity is, the people who drive the culture and set up the organization and the organization's goals and values should also be responsible for equity.
Well, and what I hear in all that, that kind of cascades down up the hierarchy, because obviously in a meeting or the colleague that your colleague observed, they got more scrutiny, maybe because of their demographics. That's a role that every employee can play, right? To call out. I mean, one of the most, I think, really unfortunate things is like a pile on in a meeting, right? Where sometimes it's just someone needs to say stop or slow down or let's take a beat, right? Because it can be really devastating to a person, right? And to and also to defend, right? Hey, like we don't, assess other projects like this. Why are we assessing this one like this, right? And maybe not about the person always, but just to kind of make it about the work a little bit, but to call that out and to be an ally, but also back to who you fund all the way to the top, right? Because I think even having diverse founders, if they've got, let's say venture ownership who's not aligned with those values, right? That's a challenge. So even picking who your funders are, right? That let the founders, you think about all the way up to the top, right? To the ownership, and I think we're proud to be a certified LGBT owned business. There's only about 12 SaaS businesses in the United States of America that are certified LGBT owned. Mm-hmm. You got a number that are run by LGBTQ people, but they're not always getting to make all the decisions, right? Because based on the ownership or the equity. And so, and I think that's why StartOut's work is so important. We're so glad that they're hosting this. When you think about equity contextually, right? What's equity mean, right? Equity might mean one thing in Brazil versus Kentucky versus Menlo, Park or Mountain View or something like that. So how do we think about equity sort of contextually, whether it's the organization or the geography or the industry? Is this one measurement of equity, or how is it sort of contextual? I mean, Brittany, do you want to start with that, and we'll do Candice and Dominic?
Yeah, so I'll contextualize it through the lens of our founders that we support, right? So we work exclusively with Latina and Black women founders, and we found that when it comes to raising capital, together they received less than 1%. That number jumped above 1% for the first time in 2020, as you can imagine, because in the cultural zeitgeist, we had this awareness, but then it promptly dropped back down, right? Once we got reasonably comfortable. And so for us, when we're thinking about equity, we see these founders who are disruptors in their industry, who are innovative. We ask them about their challenges. We realize, Ben, to your point about how these pileups in meetings, and Candice, you mentioned, onlookers looking at that. We speak with investors as well as our founders, and we've identified the difference between promotion questions, where founders are given the opportunity to share their expertise, and prevention questions, which are really to downgrade them, right? And make them seem less competent and qualified than they actually are. Can you guess who tends to get the prevention questions? And so from our perspective, as we're focused on programming and advocacy, we're creating a safe space where we can upskill these founders and prepare them, knowing what the numbers are, right? Knowing that 99% of the time you may not receive that funding. However, this does not mean that you should not go forward and seek those opportunities. There are firms that are seeking to provide you with that support and giving them the knowledge and the discernment to know the difference.
Ooh, I love that. The prevention versus promotion. Oh, yes. And Joan Williams has some really great research that I think relates to that when she talks about bias busters. And some of the differences in performance and performance reviews across different groups. But yeah, I think in terms of the context of equity, I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the other definitions of equity, which is around financial equity, ownership in an entity and organization. And the context around that. When I first took a job in tech, I remember negotiating my salary. I had been, spent a ton of time at the first organization I worked at, Candice, where we talked a lot about women in negotiation and how gendered money can be in terms of how we're socialized. And so I was really excited about, but very scared about negotiating my salary. And I remember being offered the opportunity to negotiate the cash base or the equity. And this was a private startup. And I was like, yeah, show me the money, give me the cash. Let's talk about cash. And I had no idea about the potential value of equity and ownership. Let's talk about the ownership gap, right? And the percentage of incredibly valuable companies that women or LGBTQ or Black or Latinx people own, right? I didn't even know about ownership and those types of numbers. And now I've built a part of an angel collective called the Black Angel Group. We started it within Google for Black Googlers to really basically get people into angel investing at pretty low risk. So we have a group SPV, where a special purpose vehicle, where we bring lots of different people together to put smaller amounts in, but that adds up to a larger check into companies. And then I will leverage, the deals I get access to with the founders in my day job, if they're interested, to diversify their cap tables. And so understanding equity in that context and the gap between ownership, which then translates into the type of wealth that is generational and passed on, that context I think is important to eliminate.
And I know as an HR person, people will be offered equity packages, but the exercise windows and things, you have layoffs and people have only so much time to, do these things, and they're not always thoughtful about who's got, if the founders all went to Stanford and they all have been at 3 companies and they all have, there's a mindset of benchmarking and knowing how many outstanding shares and what your percentage is, and if there's dilution, where the rounds are, and there's a lot of technical detail. But if it's the first time that you've been offered equity, oftentimes they're like, okay, cool, great. Take it or I'll take the cash. And so I think that's a great example of, even if equity is in the company is evenly being sort of distributed, People don't know what to do with it or take
Right.
it up, or that they have are these shares or these options. Oh, I have to do something with the option. Like there's a lot to sort of think about. Dominic, you're smiling. I'm going to yield to you.
No, I mean, you just bring up a lot of good points, but going back to the beginning of the conversation, Ben, of what you brought up of where you are in the world and how does that relate to equity within an organization. I mean, Plug and Play ourselves, we are a global-based company and we're really active outside the US. And we have about 50 different office locations all around the world, some in Saudi Arabia, some in Japan. And I think when I stepped into this role, I did not realize how these conversations can go so many different ways. And I think it kind of relates to, and I saw a question in the chat, so I'll try to gear my point to that question as well. But when you are a global company in that sense, we also really focus on how our employees feel with what we're putting on an outward facing view. And I know, like, obviously it's Pride Month, and a lot of organizations have the conversation of, oh, what are we going to do this month? Are we going to change our logo? Are we going to, do so many of those things? And when I stepped into the role and so many people just started asking me these questions of, what are we doing for each month? I turned it back to them. I said, what do you want to do for this month? What is something that makes you feel comfortable? And our employees that are part of those groups, really hearing from them. And based on the conversations we've had with them, we haven't changed our logo and we're not going to change it. And we do a lot of things internally as a company that will actually promote, these different groups throughout the different months, but really catering towards how our employees feel on a global basis, and having those conversations really is what pushes us to define what equity means contextually to us as an organization. And then later on, we'll educate our ecosystem of what it means to us and continue to have those conversations.
Brittany, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that's really well said. And, so I think we're good there.
Well, I'm going to do a laser round question because I want to also provide the opportunity for each of our panelists, and I'll provide a few as well, kind of tips, practical advice. When people come to these events, there's theory and big picture ideas and vision, but people often are energized around that and then want to do something kind of in their organizations. And Jared Kaplan's got a question in the chat around that as well. But, thinking, the last question kind of in a laser round is thinking about how organizations can impact equity outside their organization, beyond their organization. Often, we've talked a lot about kind of inside the walls or with employees or maybe with certain customers. Thoughts around how organizations can have a kind of a bigger play and multiplier effect on equity. Candice, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Yes. So my role is kind of interesting because a portion of it is actually outward facing. So part of it's inward facing, part of it's portfolio facing, and part of it's like actually ecosystem, like broadly facing. And that includes like our partnership with StartOut. There is no single venture firm that is magically going to change the entire industry, although I really admire the firms that do things their way on their terms. And so we do a lot of coalition building. For example, tomorrow I'll be hosting in New York City a breakfast with a number of largely New York-based venture capital firms, and we're talking about the funding gap for underrepresented founders. And we're going to specifically try to focus in on a couple of practices people are already trying, so that we could kind of globalize that across the firms that we represent, as well as firms that we know outside of that. Other great examples, this week, I just joined the board of an organization, Venture Forward, which is focused on diversity in venture capital more broadly. And they do really great work around bringing emerging underrepresented fund managers together with LPs that are deploying or will deploy or will have allocation, and can provide mentorship to these emerging managers, because nobody really teaches you how to play the game so much when you're starting, your first fund, in terms of where to go to and who to go to. And especially, we already talked, my co-panelists already talked about this current economy. So I hear from a lot of emerging fund managers who are asking about allocation. Alphabet has provided some allocation to underrepresented Black fund managers, for example, in 2020. But now, where do I direct folks? Like, I don't want to say, hey, this is my firm and we look at these things. Sorry, can't help you. If I have a really promising entrepreneur building a startup impacting the LGBTQ community, but they're at a pre-seed stage, which our fund doesn't work much in pre-seed. I need to know what other funds are going to be likely to engage with them and be interested, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of ways to think about this work more broadly than our particular fund. There have been also some coalition efforts in 2020 that I had never seen before. So managing partners of different firms were directly trying to get involved in some solutions. And so there was a series of meetings of managing partners of, you name it, like incredible firms, but they didn't really know quite what to do, right? So my goal is to get that group back together, and I think we'll go further with numbers.
Great. And Brittany, your thoughts?
I was just thinking, Candice, is there room at that brunch?
Yes.
But to your point, we work with a lot of founders that are pre-seed. We have a number of programs. We support founders from ideation through to 7- and 8-figure businesses. And we accept the whole identity of the founder, right? We work with Latina and Black women founders who also are, across the LGBTQIA+ spectrum, right? And it's important that we continue allyship, such as partnership with StartOut. We've done community workshop events with StartOut. I'm looking forward to a continued wonderful relationship with StartOut. But again, really understanding that you do not have to do this alone. There are many organizations that I speak with, investors who say, we want to do something, but we don't know what to do. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are organizations like our own. We have the curriculum, we have the founders, we have the programming, the advocacy, and most importantly, the research ready and available, but we also need the access. So opportunities like this where we can uplift the work, build relationships, build connections is invaluable. And I hope those who are watching understand just how important the power of connection is.
Amazing. Dominique?
Yeah, I would say, here at Plug and Play, we really focus on the organizations that we bring into our brand as a whole. And we have about over 500 Fortune 100, 500 corporations sitting on our platform. And we really, when we built Drive, our diversity arm, we said this is a community-centered, initiative. And we really want to rely on what Walmart brings to the table, what US Bank brings to the table, and making sure that these founders feel recognized and valued by these bigger corporations on the fight to reaching funding. But then also, I think as an organization, historically, we've always worked with college level students and getting them in the door and having them learn about VC so that later on they realize this is a pathway for them moving forward. But as of recently, we've started working with youth groups. So anywhere from K through 12th of just instilling these things at a younger age, because I do know, as Candice mentioned, there's not a whole bunch of Black fund managers out there, and there's a reason for that. As well as any other underrepresented founder, just giving these kids tools at a younger age for them to be able to think about this in the future is where we really want to start having our influence and impacting that outside of our organization. So I know a lot of our employees are teaching different classes, and that's really what we strive to do for just different underserved communities around our surrounding area.
And I'll just share, in addition, engine.is, I just put the address here. I know Google's a funder and other things. It's a startup advocacy organization that also focuses on leveling the playing field as well. I just went to Washington, D.C. last month to lobby senators, since Senator Schumer's office and others around, changing the definition of an accredited investor to be more broad and expansive, right? Unified privacy frameworks that lower the barriers to entry for startups to start, right? And some of the taxes that are on small businesses. So there's ways that you can affect these things that can be very, very, very powerful. Also, supplier diversity. If you're in an organization and you're helping to make buying decisions, consider in the competition, looking at diverse owned businesses, right? That's another way that you can affect equity. You're not going to do business with an organization just because they're diverse owned, but let them compete for the business. rather than just use the kind of usual suspects, right, is another key way. So we're going to go around real quick, and I'm asked to keep it to 60 seconds each around, advice, tips, action, right? What can we do to take this aspiration of equity and make it more of a reality? So Dominique, I'll have you go first, Brittany second, and then Candice third. So Dominique?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go quick, just holding people accountable, continuing to question why people are doing things, how they're doing it, and just doing the follow-ups to do your self-justice.
Yeah. I'll pass on the wisdom passed to me by a mentor. Stop approaching your power with humility. There's power in curiosity. There's power in vulnerability. There's power in the decision-making practices that you have within your organization. Use them and continue to ask why and to what end.
And I'll just say, I'm taking in what my co-panelist just said. I recently spoke to one of our company leaders who is a chief revenue officer of a generative AI enterprise company, who also happens to be a fantastic ally for a lot of this work. So I would say if you're feeling kind of alone in your organization or in what you're trying to achieve, finding others with aligned goals and values, including in some unlikely places in your organizations, no offense, is really, really important. It can help you feel validated.
And I think, if you're a founder, and there's a lot of founders that are joining this summit today, just founder to founder as well. I would just say, one of the things we don't believe in free work at Pilot. Make all of your internships paid. We had a bunch of international students that were willing to do unpaid internships. They're from Vietnam. They're fantastic. We hired them through another StartOut company that does internship programs, but we insisted on paying them, right? Insist on paying people for work. If you have the same roles, pay people the same. Don't make them negotiate a better deal. Make it transparent is another thing you can do. Offering flexibility is a big unlock, right? And have that be meaningful. You have no idea what people have to manage in their lives, right? And what they're up against. So, really, thinking how people can succeed outside of work so they can succeed at work is another big unlock around equity. And helping people get a proper home office setup. If you're remote, don't assume that a laptop is enough. Get them the green screen, get them the light, get them the this, get them the multiple monitors, everything so people can be effective, the backup Wi-Fi hotspot, everything that people might need, right? These are really, and then even in your interviewing process, like, culture fit interviews can be a real, rat's nest, right? And so you want to make sure that those are standardized, that they're trying to root out bias, et cetera. So we've got, I would love for you to connect with all these attendees on LinkedIn. For any of you that joined, I'd love for you to put in the chat something you're taking away, a feeling, a thought, an action. It's great feedback for all of us. Additionally, there's a form that Stephen Yan put in around feedback. All of us on the panel want feedback. Part of being inclusive, right, is asking and soliciting and listening for that feedback. So there's a simple form. It helps us, do an even better job at these things. We've got about a minute and a half left. So any quick things, Candice, Brittany, then Dominique, that you take away from this? What is your kind of synthesis from all this?
Well, I guess one thing I do want to say also was the question in the chat that was around external communication and Dominique's thoughts around that, it being Pride Month, right? I noticed a lot fewer logo changes this year. And the rationale, I think, one of the questions was, is it because people don't want to be performative? And in some cases, clearly, yes. However, I do not buy that is the case for everyone. And I'm like, if someone can scroll through and see a symbol of like, you are welcome here, it can be meaningful. So, but whatever makes sense for each organization. And so, yes, do the stuff before you talk about it. That's my biggest thing on that, on that statement. Like if you have if you literally have an employee sitting there right now saying, why aren't we doing anything, but you changed the logo, that is understandably not the way to proceed. But don't talk about things until you're really sure that they're having the impact that you intended them to. And I guess a more general takeaway, I actually really liked what Dominique and Brittany shared around like individually, accountability, having a voice, speaking up, I think those are the things that are necessary for me to put in practice to be successful. So I appreciate the reminders.
Brittany, how about you?
Thank you. Just Emma's comment about equity in design. I think that's an underrated aspect of equity, and I would just love to see that more.
Dominic?
This is just, no, I really just appreciate sitting on the panel with Candice and Brittany. I mean, I learned a lot myself and a lot of takeaways here. So I really just appreciate the opportunity and sitting with you lovely ladies.
Well, thanks for being, you made my job as the moderator easy because, are like 10x smarter than me on all of these subjects. So that was great. And thanks everyone that joined and put the comments in the chat. Again, fill out that survey. I will say the same thing I say at many talks I give in places I'm into. 2 words: do something. Right? There's, I have a coaching background. There's a grand canyon between knowing something and doing something. Knowledge, with ChatGPT and all those great things, knowledge is cheap. It's a commodity. We can find it. We can Alexa it. We can everything else, or Google Home it, right? And so, but you want to do something. That's really what you take some action, be involved in the conversation, speak up in the meeting for someone. So thanks everyone to StartOut for hosting this and all the great sponsors behind this great event. And make sure to connect with the panelists on LinkedIn. Get involved in angel investing if you can. Support and mentor others. And give to organizations like StartOut because they do a great deal of service in our community. So happy Pride Month, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the summit. And thank you for a great session. Cheers, everyone.
Happy Pride.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.